The first machine left quietly. That was how Dale Pruitt had planned it. No auction, no announcement, no signs at the end of the driveway. Just a private sale to a farmer 2 counties over who needed a tractor and didn't ask many questions. The green machine was gone before 7 in the morning, trailered out in the dark the way a man moves something he doesn't want the neighbors to see. Dale backed the Massey Ferguson into the equipment shed before noon. That was March. By the following September, he had done it 5 more times. 6 machines, 18 months. One at a time, each one quiet, each one a private arrangement that moved across county lines and left no obvious trail. He thought he was managing it carefully. He thought the color change in his shed was his business and nobody else's. He thought he was one farmer making equipment decisions on his own land, and that was the beginning and the end of it. He was wrong about all of that. Dale Pruitt farmed 1,100 acres in central Kentucky, split between burley tobacco and grain. The tobacco ground ran along the creek bottoms where the soil was deep and dark and had been worked by his family since his grandfather broke it in the early 50s. The grain acres were mostly corn and soybeans on the upland fields that his father had cleared and tiled through the 70s. It was a mixed operation that demanded mixed machinery, and Dale had built his equipment line over 12 years into a collection that worked for what he needed. He had run John Deere since he took over from his father. Not because he had done a deep comparative analysis. He ran John Deere because his father had run John Deere, and his father before that, and because the dealership in town, Hensley Equipment, run by a man named Clay Hensley, whose own father had started the business in 1968, was 15 miles from Dale's farm and had never once failed to answer the phone. Clay Hensley was 63 years old and had the kind of institutional knowledge about the farm operations in his county that no computer system could replicate. He knew who ran what ground. He knew who was leveraged and who wasn't. He knew whose fathers had paid their accounts on time and whose hadn't. He knew which farms were expanding and which were quietly shrinking. He knew all of this the way a man knows things when he has spent his entire working life in a single community selling essential equipment to men who could not farm without it. Clay Hensley and Dale Pruitt had a relationship that was not a friendship, but was more than a transaction. They had sat across from each other in the dealership office every few years and worked out financing on equipment purchases without either man raising his voice. Clay had called Dale personally the spring. Dale's wife was sick and asked if he needed the payment deferred. Dale had said no and paid on time, but he remembered the call. That was the relationship. It was real. And Dale had decided to end it without saying so. The reason was horsepower, and the reason was money, and the reason was a conversation Dale had overheard at the grain elevator in October 2 years before the first machine left. 2 farmers were talking about the Massey Ferguson 8S series. One of them had demoed one that summer on a neighbor's recommendation. He was not a demonstrative man. He was the kind of farmer who described machinery the way a doctor describes test results, with precision and without enthusiasm. And what he said was that the power delivery was different from what he'd expected, and the cab visibility on field operations was better than anything he'd run in that horsepower class, and the fuel consumption numbers had come in lower than his John Deere equivalent on the same operation. Dale Pruitt stood 12 feet away, pretending to look at a posted commodity sheet and listen to every word. He drove home and started reading. He was not a man who made decisions on overheard conversations, but he was a man who filed information and followed it up, and over the next 3 months, he followed this up thoroughly. He called a Massey Ferguson dealer in the next county, not the one closest to home, because he was already thinking about discretion. He requested specifications on the 8S265 and the 7S series. He asked for fuel consumption data. He asked about parts availability and service response times. He asked about financing structures. The dealer, a younger man named Holt, who had taken over his father's business 4 years prior, sent everything Dale asked for within 48 hours and followed up with a phone call that lasted an hour. Holt was not a high-pressure salesman. He answered questions directly, and when he didn't know something, he said so and found out. Dale noted this. He also noted the price differential. On a comparable horsepower basis, the Massey Ferguson equipment came in lower than his current John Deere line. Not dramatically, not enough to make the decision by itself. But in an operation that ran on the margins that tobacco and grain farming ran on in central Kentucky, lower was not nothing. Dale told Holt he'd be in touch. He went home and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and started thinking through how to do this quietly. The first machine that left was a John Deere 6R utility tractor that Dale had used primarily for tobacco work, setting plants, pulling spray equipment through the creek bottom fields, general farm utility. He sold it to a man in Garrard County who was looking for exactly that configuration and paid a fair price without negotiating. The deal was done in a phone call, and the machine left on a Tuesday. The Massey Ferguson 7S.165 that replaced it arrived the following Friday. Dale had it backed into the south equipment shed by mid-morning. He did not tell anyone it was coming. His hired hand, a man named Curtis, who had worked for Dale for 9 years, saw it when he came in at noon and looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. Dale said, "New machine." Curtis said, "I see that." That was the extent of the conversation. Over the following 18 months, Dale repeated this process 5 more times. A John Deere 8R row crop tractor replaced by a Massey Ferguson 8S.265. The combine replaced by a Massey Ferguson Ideal 8. 2 smaller utility machines swapped out in separate transactions 6 months apart. The planter traded quietly through a dealer in a neighboring state to reduce local visibility. Each transaction was structured to minimize notice. Dale was deliberate about this in a way that, in retrospect, he would understand had been both sensible and naive. Sensible because it avoided the kind of public spectacle that small county communities turn into permanent conversation. Naive because in a county where Clay Hensley had been selling farm equipment for 35 years, the disappearance of 6 John Deere machines from a 1,100-acre operation did not go unnoticed by anyone who was paying attention. Clay Hensley was always paying attention. He didn't say anything to Dale directly. He wasn't that kind of man. He didn't make phone calls to confront customers who were moving their business. He understood that a man had the right to buy whatever iron he wanted for his own farm, and he was not going to argue with that right out loud. But Clay Hensley had spent 35 years building relationships in that county that ran deeper than equipment sales, and one of those relationships was with the agricultural lending officer at the regional bank that held Dale Pruitt's operating line of credit. The operating line was not a small number. Dale borrowed against it every spring to cover seed, fertilizer, crop inputs, and operating expenses before the crop revenue came in at harvest. It was a standard arrangement for an operation his size. He had held the line for 11 years. He had never missed a payment. His credit was clean, and his financials were solid, and there was no objective reason for any lender to look at Dale Pruitt's account and see a problem. But in February, 4 months before planting and 11 months after the last Massey Ferguson had arrived in Dale's shed, Clay Hensley had lunch with the ag lending officer at the diner on Main Street. They had lunch there 4 times a year, had done so for a decade and a half. It was not a formal meeting. It was not a conspiracy. It was 2 men who had worked adjacent to each other in the same agricultural community for a long time, eating lunch and talking about what they were seeing in the county. What Clay Hensley said about Dale Pruitt at that lunch was not a lie. He did not fabricate anything. He expressed concern. He noted that Dale had made significant equipment changes that represented a departure from established relationships in the community. He suggested, in the measured way that men like Clay Hensley suggest things, that an operation making that kind of wholesale change might benefit from closer scrutiny of its financial position. He did not ask the lender to freeze Dale's operating line. He didn't have to ask. Dale Pruitt found out what had happened on a Thursday morning in March when he drove to the bank to finalize his spring operating line renewal and sat down across from the ag lending officer and was told that the line was under review. He sat very still when the officer said this. He asked what had changed. His numbers hadn't changed. His repayment history hadn't changed. He had not missed a payment in 11 years of borrowing from this institution, and he wanted to understand what had triggered a review. The officer was professionally evasive in the way that bank officers are trained to be professionally evasive. He spoke about portfolio risk and changing market conditions and said the review would be completed within 30 days and that Dale should not be alarmed. Dale drove home. He sat in his truck in his driveway for 15 minutes before he went inside. He was not a man who panicked quickly. He had farmed through drought years and commodity price crashes and a hailstorm in 2019 that had taken 40% of his corn crop in an afternoon. He understood that farming was an industry in which the ground moved under you, whether you were ready for it or not, and that the only productive response to instability was to think clearly and act precisely. He thought clearly. He did not like what the clear thinking produced. Planting was 11 weeks away. His seed order was placed. His fertilizer was contracted. His crop insurance was renewed. His equipment was fueled and maintained and ready to go into the field. Everything was in place except the operating money that moved all of it, and the operating money was frozen in a review that had no legitimate financial basis, and that Dale now understood, with a clarity that settled in his chest like cold weight, had been triggered by a phone call or a lunch or a quiet word from a man who had watched 6 green machines disappear from a yard and decided to use the tools available to him. Dale Pruitt had underestimated what he was dealing with. He had thought he was buying equipment. He had not understood that he was also leaving a community structure that had its own enforcement mechanisms, and that those mechanisms did not require legal action or formal process. They only required a lunch at the right diner with the right man. He spent 4 days making calls before he told anyone what was happening. The first calls were to other lenders. He had relationships at 2 farm credit institutions outside the county, not strong relationships, but existing ones. He laid out his financials honestly and asked what they could do for spring operating capital on a compressed timeline. Both institutions were interested. One could move faster than the other. Dale took notes and asked for formal proposals in writing. The second call was to Holt, the Massey Ferguson dealer. Dale told Holt what had happened without editorializing. He said the operating line was frozen, and he needed to understand if there were financing structures through the equipment side that could bridge any gap while he secured alternative lending. He said he was not panicking, but he needed to know his options. Holt listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then he said he would make 3 calls before noon and get back to Dale by end of day. He made the calls. He got back to Dale at 4:15 that afternoon with 2 concrete options: an extended payment deferral arrangement on the equipment notes that would free up cash flow for the planting season, and a referral to an agricultural finance broker who worked specifically with farming operations in transition. Dale wrote down everything Holt said. He thanked him and hung up. He had not expected that level of response. He had expected the equipment dealer to express sympathy and do nothing, because that was often what happened when a customer called with a problem that wasn't the dealer's problem. Holt had treated it like it was his problem. Dale filed that away. The 5th call, the one he had been putting off, was to his wife Linda, who was visiting her sister in Louisville, and who did not know any of this had happened. That conversation was the hardest one. Not because Linda was unreasonable. She was not unreasonable. She was a woman who had made hard decisions alongside Dale for 24 years and who did not flinch at hard numbers or hard realities. The conversation was hard because Dale had made the decision to switch the equipment without telling her the full picture of what it might cost them relationally and financially in this community. And Linda had a right to know that the quiet, private decisions her husband had made over 18 months had led to a Thursday morning at the bank being told their operating line was under review. Linda came home on Saturday instead of Sunday. She sat at the kitchen table and listened to everything. Then she asked 2 questions. The first was whether the alternative financing would cover the spring. Dale said yes, with some compression on other expenses. The second question was whether the Massey Ferguson equipment would perform in the season ahead. Dale said he believed it would. Linda looked at him for a moment. She said, "You should have told me." He said, "Yes." She said, "What do we do now?" He told her what they were going to do. She listened. She did not disagree with any of it. She poured coffee for both of them, and they sat at the table until past 10 o'clock going through the numbers together. And when they were done, Linda said it was manageable, and Dale said yes, and neither of them said anything about Clay Hensley or the lunch at the diner because there was nothing productive to say about it, and they were both practical enough to know that. The alternative financing came through in late March. It was not as clean as the existing operating line had been. The rate was marginally higher. The terms required more documentation. It added administrative time that Dale did not have to spare in the weeks before planting. He absorbed all of it and planted on schedule. The Massey Ferguson equipment went into the fields in April. Curtis, his hired hand, had spent the winter months getting familiar with the new machines. Reading, asking questions, spending time in cabs in the shed during the cold months when the days were short, and there was time to learn before the season demanded performance. Curtis was a methodical man who took machinery seriously, and by the time planting started, he was running the equipment with the kind of competence that came from preparation rather than instinct. The tobacco went in on schedule. The corn ground was planted across a 10-day window that hit the soil temperature targets Dale had been waiting for. The soybean acres went in behind the corn without the delays he had feared. The Massey Ferguson 8S 265 performed in the grain ground the way the specifications had suggested it would. The power delivery was consistent. The fuel consumption came in close to the figures Holt had quoted. The cab on the Ideal 8 Combine was different from what Curtis had run before, but not worse. A matter of orientation rather than quality, and Curtis had oriented himself during the winter months. The equipment did not let them down. What the equipment could not fix was the social landscape Dale had altered by walking away from Clay Hensley's dealership without a conversation. The grain elevator manager, a man who had known Dale's father, was cooler that spring than he had been in previous years. Not unfriendly, just cooler. The kind of temperature drop that is not dramatic enough to name but is consistent enough to feel. A neighboring farmer who had borrowed Dale's grain cart for 2 seasons in a row didn't ask that year. Small things, none of them decisive, all of them present. Dale noticed each one. He did not complain about any of them, because complaint required acknowledging that he had misread something, and what he had misread was the depth of what he was disrupting. He had thought equipment was equipment. He had not thought clearly enough about what equipment represented in a community where Clay Hensley had been present for every significant agricultural decision made by every significant farm operation in the county for 35 years. You did not leave that without consequence. The only question was whether the consequence was survivable. By October, the harvest numbers were in. The corn averaged well above county mean. The soybeans came off clean. The tobacco crop, which was the most management-intensive piece of the operation and the most financially significant on a per-acre basis, had been a strong year, one of the better yields Dale had seen in a decade. The Massey Ferguson equipment had performed across every operation without a failure that had cost him meaningful downtime. He sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad in the second week of October and did what he always did. He added the columns, he ran the totals, he compared the year's performance against the previous 3 years' averages. The numbers were good, not good enough to eliminate the higher financing costs on the alternative operating line, not good enough to repair a relationship with a lending institution that had been redirected by a lunch he hadn't been invited to, not good enough to warm the elevator manager or bring back the borrowed equipment requests or restore the texture of a community relationship that had changed in a way that might take years to fully understand, but good enough to continue. That was what Dale wrote at the bottom of the legal pad. Not a victory, not a vindication, a single word, continue. In November, Holt drove out to the farm for the first time. Dale had not invited him before the season. There had been no time, and Dale was not a man who entertained during work seasons. But Holt called in October and asked if he could come out and walk through the equipment with them before winter, go over any issues from the season, discuss the spring service schedule. Dale said to come on the 3rd Tuesday of November. Holt arrived on time and shook hands with Dale and Curtis both. He spent 2 hours going through each machine methodically, asking Curtis specific questions about performance across different field conditions and listening to the answers with genuine attention. He found 2 minor service items that should be addressed before spring. He arranged both without Dale having to follow up. Before Holt left, he and Dale stood in the driveway for a few minutes. Holt asked directly how the season had gone overall. Dale told him about the financing situation. He had not told Holt the full picture in March, only the operational facts. He told him now. Holt listened to all of it. Holt said, "I've seen that before, not often, but I've seen it." Dale said, "I didn't think it would go that far." Holt said, "When you pull out of a relationship that old in a county that small, it goes further than the equipment." Dale said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, I understand that now." Holt nodded once. He did not say anything else about it. He got in his truck and drove out, and Dale stood in the driveway in the November cold, watching the truck until it turned onto the county road. What Dale Pruitt had learned across 18 months of quiet decisions and one loud March morning at the bank was not what he had expected to learn when he started reading Massey Ferguson's specifications at a kitchen table 3 winters ago. He had expected to learn about equipment. He had learned about equipment. The machines were capable. The service infrastructure had held. The Ideal 8 had run through harvest without a critical failure. The horsepower numbers had delivered what they promised in the field. The economics, net of the financing complications, had been defensible. What he had not expected to learn was the lesson that came with the higher financing rate and the cooler greeting at the elevator and the neighbor who didn't ask for the grain cart. The lesson was not that Clay Hensley was a vindictive man. Clay Hensley was not a vindictive man. He was a man who had built something over 35 years and who moved naturally to protect it the way any man moves to protect what he has built. Dale understood this now with a clarity that he had not had in the equipment shed at 7 in the morning, backing a Massey Ferguson into the space where a John Deere used to be. The lesson was that in a small agricultural county, equipment choice is not a private decision. It is a public statement. It is made in front of people who have long memories and established networks and the patience to wait for leverage to appear. You could make the statement quietly, the way Dale had tried to, but the statement got made regardless. The only thing the quiet accomplished was that Dale didn't see the response coming until he was sitting across from a bank officer in March, being told his operating line was under review. Next time, if there was a next time, he would make the statement directly. He would sit across from Clay Hensley in the dealership office and tell him straight that he was moving his business and why, and give the man the respect of an honest conversation rather than the insult of a slow disappearance. Whether that would have changed the outcome was a question Dale could not answer. It might not have changed anything, but it would have been the right way to do it. He was still learning. He had farmed for 22 years, and he was still learning. That was not a comfortable thing to know about yourself at his age, but it was an honest thing, and honest was the only way Dale Pruitt had ever known how to operate. The legal pad said continue. He was going to continue. The equipment was in the shed. The season was coming. He went back to work.